The mud was swallowing her whole. Theresa Gentry stood in the center of the rain-drenched street of Caldwell, Kansas, her boots buried past the ankle in a thick river of brown muck, her trunk sitting useless behind her like a tombstone in a grave she had not yet dug. The stagecoach had broken a wheel at the edge of town, and the driver had simply unhitched the horses and walked away, leaving his passengers to fend for themselves. Every other traveler had scattered to doorways and awnings, clutching their valises and carpetbags, light enough to run. But Theresa could not run. She had everything she owned in that trunk. Every dress, every letter, every photograph, every last scrap of evidence that she had once belonged somewhere and to someone. And right now, the mud was winning. She yanked at the handle with both hands. The trunk did not move. It only sank deeper, mocking her with its weight, with the weight of a life she had been trying so desperately to carry forward. The rain hammered the wide brim of her hat and streamed down her neck, soaking through the high collar of her traveling dress until the wool clung to her skin. Thunder rolled low and thick over the Kansas prairie, and somewhere behind her, a woman laughed from a covered porch. Theresa did not look up to see who it was. She already knew she was the spectacle. She already knew what she looked like. A woman alone, overdressed, drowning in mud in a town she had never been to before, on her way to marry a man she had never met. And that man, she had just discovered 20 minutes ago when the stagecoach wheel cracked and sent a letter sliding out from beneath the seat cushion. A letter addressed to the driver from one Walter Hatch of Caldwell, Kansas, was not the kind, prosperous rancher he had described himself to be in his correspondence. He was a known creditor, a lender with a reputation for using women as collateral. The letter had said so in plain, ugly language that no woman should ever have to read about herself. Livestock and a bride arriving together, right when she is settled, and I will come for the note. That was what she was to Walter Hatch. A note, something to come for. She pulled at the trunk again, desperate now, the rain blurring her vision, and she heard the mud make a horrible sucking sound as the trunk shifted sideways and began to tip. Do not let go. The voice came from behind her, low and steady and utterly calm, like a man who had walked through 100 storms and found none of them particularly impressive. Before Theresa could turn around or respond or even breathe, a pair of large, leather-gloved hands appeared beside hers on the trunk handle, and with one smooth, unhurried pull, the trunk came free from the mud with a sound like a cannon shot. She stumbled backward and would have fallen if a forearm had not caught her across the back, solid and certain as a fence rail. She turned around. The man standing behind her was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a dark hat pulled low over a face that was weathered but still young, somewhere in his late 20s by her reckoning. He had dark eyes that held a particular quality she had rarely seen in a man's eyes, the quality of someone who looked at things steadily, without flinching. His coat was already soaked through. He had clearly been standing in the rain for longer than the 5 seconds it had taken him to cross the street to help her. He was carrying her trunk as though it weighed nothing at all, mud dripping from the bottom of it, and he was already walking toward the covered boardwalk without being asked and without waiting for permission. "That is my trunk," Theresa said, because she could not think of anything more dignified to say. "I noticed," he said, without stopping. "I did not ask for your help." "No, you did not," he agreed pleasantly, setting the trunk down under the overhang of what appeared to be the general store with a gentle thud that nonetheless rattled the window glass. He straightened up, turned around, and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "But nobody travels light when I am around, so you might as well save the lecture for someone who left you to drown." Theresa Gentry stared at him for a long moment in the rain. Then she stepped up onto the boardwalk and stood beside her trunk, and she did not say thank you because something about the way he said it, matter of fact and without any expectation of gratitude, meant that thank you would have been the wrong currency entirely. "Perry Monroe," he said, pulling off one glove and extending his hand. "Theresa Gentry," she replied and shook it, and that was how it began. But to understand why that moment in the mud changed everything, you have to understand where Theresa Gentry had come from, and what she was carrying in that trunk besides dresses and letters. You have to understand the weight of the life she had packed into it, and why a drifter with steady eyes and no particular destination was the last person she expected to matter. Theresa had grown up in St. Louis, Missouri, in a household that had once been comfortable, and had become something considerably less so after her father's death in 1878. She had been 23 years old then, already considered slightly past the prime age for marriage by the society she moved in, and the death of her father had left her and her mother in a precarious position. Her mother had died the following winter from a fever, and Theresa had found herself alone, working as a seamstress in a tailor's shop on Olive Street, living in a boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage and other people's regrets. She was not a woman given to self-pity. That was important to understand. Theresa Gentry was practical in the way that only women who have had to be practical truly are, the kind of practical that does not cry over circumstances but simply looks for the next handhold. She was also proud, in a quiet, unflinching way that had nothing to do with vanity. She kept herself well, she kept her word, and she kept her opinions to herself when the keeping of them was the wiser course of action. It was the practical part of her that had answered the advertisement in the Missouri Republican in the spring of 1880. Rancher in Caldwell, Kansas, seeks a wife of good character and steady temperament. Correspondence welcomed. Walter Hatch had written her 4 letters over the course of 3 months, and each one had been well composed and entirely convincing. He had described his ranch, his cattle operation, his plans to expand. He had been courteous and had not asked for anything indecent. She had said yes to coming out to meet him, which was not quite the same as saying yes to marrying him, but the distinction had felt slimmer with every mile west the stagecoach had carried her. And then the letter had slid out from under the seat cushion, and the distinction had become a canyon. She was standing on the boardwalk in Caldwell, Kansas, in the rain, with everything she owned, a ruined marriage prospect, no money to return to St. Louis, and a drifter named Perry Monroe who was leaning against the post beside her as though he had nowhere else to be. "You look like a woman who just had a plan fall apart," Perry said. He was not looking at her. He was watching the rain come down on the street, which somehow made the observation less intrusive than it might have been. "My plans are my own business," Theresa said. "Fair enough," he replied. A silence settled between them that was not entirely uncomfortable, which surprised her. Most silences with strangers were uncomfortable. This one had a different quality, like the silence before a piece of music begins, when the air is already full of something waiting to happen. "Are you staying in Caldwell?" She asked because she needed information, and because asking a direct question was always more efficient than circling around it. "Passing through," Perry said. "Where are you headed?" He considered this for a moment as though the question were more philosophical than geographical. "West, maybe New Mexico territory, maybe further." He paused. "I tend to find out where I am going when I get there." "That sounds like a very uncertain way to live," Theresa said. "It is," he agreed, and there was something in his voice when he said it that was not quite contentment and not quite resignation, but something in between, something that sounded to Theresa's ear like a man who had chosen uncertainty because certainty had broken him once and he had not yet decided to trust it again. She did not press him on it. She had her own broken things to manage. The rain eased slightly as the afternoon wore on, dropping from a downpour to a steady, sulking drizzle. Theresa needed to solve several immediate problems. She needed a place to sleep. She needed to eat. She needed to find out what to do about Walter Hatch, because as much as she wanted to simply disappear from his orbit, she had agreed to correspond with him, and he would be expecting her. And the last thing a woman alone in a strange town needed was a creditor and known bully coming to find her. She had $42 in her purse, which was everything she had left after the stage fare. It was not enough to get back to St. Louis. It was barely enough to sustain her in Caldwell for more than a week. Perry Monroe, she noticed, was still leaning against the post. "You are still here," she observed. "Your situation appears unresolved," he said simply. "You are not obligated to concern yourself with my situation." "No," he said, "I am not." He turned his head and looked at her, and there was nothing challenging or presumptuous in the look, just that same steady quality she had noticed immediately. "But I generally concern myself with things that need concerning about, until they are sorted out. It is a character flaw." Despite herself, despite the ruin of the afternoon and the letter and the mud and the rain, Theresa Gentry almost smiled. "I need to find lodgings," she said, "and I need information about this town." "The Caldwell House Hotel is 2 blocks north," Perry said. "Decent rates, clean enough. The owner is a woman named Clara Briggs who does not tolerate nonsense. You will be safe there." He paused. "As for information about this town, what specifically do you need to know?" She hesitated. The letter was folded in her purse. She did not know this man at all, and yet something about his quality of steadiness, something about the fact that he had simply walked into the rain and picked up her trunk without any theater or demand for acknowledgement, made her consider telling him the truth. "I need to know about a man named Walter Hatch," she said carefully. Perry Monroe went very still. It was a different kind of still from the relaxed stillness he had been wearing since they met. This was the stillness of someone who had just heard a word they recognized in a language they had hoped not to encounter again. "Why do you need to know about Walter Hatch?" His voice had not changed in tone, but it had changed in texture, the way a river changes when the current beneath the surface shifts. "He is the man I came here to marry," Theresa said. "Or rather, the man I was intending to meet. I have since reconsidered." Perry looked at her for a long moment. Then he straightened up from the post, pushed his hat back slightly, and said, "Miss Gentry, how much do you know about what Walter Hatch does for a living?" "I know he is a rancher." "He is not a rancher," Perry said flatly. "He runs cattle on land he does not own and uses the operation as cover for a money-lending and collection business that has left 3 families in this county without their properties in the last 2 years." He stopped, as though measuring how much more to say. "He is also not a man who takes disappointment gracefully." Theresa's stomach tightened. "I see. The letter you mentioned reconsidering," Perry said, his voice careful now. "Does he know you have arrived in Caldwell?" "I do not believe so yet." The stagecoach broke down at the edge of town, and there was no announcement. Perry nodded slowly, and she could see him thinking, running through something behind those dark eyes. "Then you have a small advantage, time." "Time to do what?" Theresa asked. "To figure out what you actually want to do," Perry said. "And I would suggest doing it somewhere that is not the middle of the street." He picked up her trunk again without ceremony and said, "Clara Briggs, 2 blocks north." Theresa Gentry picked up her purse, straightened her soaked shoulders, and followed him. The Caldwell house was exactly as Perry had described it. A clean, sensible establishment run by a woman of perhaps 50 with iron-gray hair, and a no-argument manner that Theresa immediately respected. Clara Briggs looked at Theresa's mud-caked boots and her soaked dress and her dignified expression, and apparently concluded that the boots and dress were circumstances, not character, and rented her a room on the 2nd floor without any unnecessary commentary. Perry set the trunk down inside the room and took his leave at the door with a brief nod that was courteous without being pointed. "Mr. Monroe," Theresa said, and he paused in the doorway. "You said you were passing through." "That is correct." "How long does passing through generally take you?" she asked. Something shifted very slightly at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, not quite not one. "Depends on what I find," he said, and left. Theresa stood in the middle of the clean, simple room and listened to his boots on the stairs, and then she sat down on the edge of the bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of feeling the full weight of her situation. The fear, the fury at Walter Hatch, the exhaustion of the journey, the strangeness of finding herself in Caldwell, Kansas with $42 and a waterlogged trunk. She felt all of it. She did not try to push it away or diminish it. because she had learned that unexpressed fear had a way of calcifying into something harder and more dangerous if you did not acknowledge it properly. Then the 5 minutes were up, and she went to work. She unpacked what she needed for the evening, found that the trunk had protected her things reasonably well from the mud and rain, and changed into dry clothing. She ate downstairs in the hotel's small dining room, a meal of roast beef and boiled potatoes that was plain but adequate, and she listened to the conversations around her with a seamstress's ear for detail, picking up threads of information about the town and its inhabitants. She learned that Caldwell in 1880 was a cattle drive town on the Kisham Trail, one of the last major shipping points before the trail ended. It was rough and lively, and full of men with money from drives and men with no money at all, and very few women who were not working in the saloons. The Texas cattle coming north kept the economy moving. There were disputes over land constantly, as the farming settlements pushed against the open-range cattle operations, and the resulting tensions made the town edgy in the particular way that frontier towns became edgy when old ways and new ways collided. She also, carefully and indirectly, learned about Walter Hatch. The picture that assembled itself from overheard conversation and a few direct questions put to Clara Briggs, who proved to have no love for the man, was exactly as grim as the letter had suggested. Hatch was 46 years old, twice widowed, and his second wife had died under circumstances that no one in town discussed openly, but that everyone seemed to believe were not natural. He was powerful in the county in the way that men who hold other men's debts are powerful, through obligation and fear rather than respect. By the time Theresa went to bed that night, she had decided two things. She was not going to meet Walter Hatch, and she was not going to leave Caldwell, not yet, not while she had no money to go anywhere meaningful. She needed a plan, and plans required information and time, and she had a small window of both if she moved carefully. She did not know whether she would see Perry Monroe again. She told herself it did not matter whether she did. She was wrong about that, but she would not find out for another 12 hours. Perry Monroe had not, in point of fact, left Caldwell. He had taken a room at a boarding house on the south end of town, run by a man named Ezra Collins, a former cattle driver who had settled, and was now exceedingly suspicious of anyone who reminded him of his former self. Perry did not tell Ezra Collins his plans because he did not entirely know what they were. He knew only that he had a particular feeling about Theresa Gentry, the kind of feeling he had learned over 29 years of living not to dismiss. Perry Monroe's history was not simple, and it was not the kind of history a man led with in conversation. He had grown up in Missouri, not far from where Theresa had lived, though they had not moved in the same circles. His father had been a farmer, and his mother had been a woman of formidable education who had taught her son to read and think and keep his word, which were the three things Perry still considered essential. His father had died in debt when Perry was 19, losing the farm to a creditor, and Perry had spent the following years moving west through various forms of work: cattle driving, scouting, hauling freight, working as a deputy in 2 towns he had subsequently left when the political nature of the job became clearer than the lawful nature of it. He was not a bad man. He was a complicated one. He had made choices in the past that he had not been proud of, not criminal choices, but choices born of desperation and youth that had cost people he cared about things they could not get back. He carried that the way he carried most things, quietly and without complaint, but it was there, a particular gravity in him that had nothing to do with physical weight. He was also, and this was relevant, not entirely a stranger to Walter Hatch. 3 years prior, Perry had been working freight through Caldwell when a family named Delaney had been removed from their homestead by Hatch's men. Perry had tried to intervene. The intervention had not gone well, legally speaking, because Hatch had the county deed records in his pocket and the homestead had been on disputed ground. Perry had left Caldwell with a bruised set of ribs and a lasting, specific, personal dislike of Walter Hatch that he had filed in the category of unfinished business. He had not come back to Caldwell intentionally. He had come through on the way to somewhere else, and then the stagecoach had broken down in the street, and a woman in a soaked wool dress had been trying to drag a trunk out of the mud with her bare dignity intact, and Perry Monroe had not been able to walk past that any more than he could have walked past a horse tangled in wire. But then she had said Walter Hatch's name, and unfinished business had rearranged itself into something that felt more like present tense. He was up before dawn. He had a habit of it, rising early and sitting with his coffee and his own thoughts before the world introduced its complications, because the complications were always easier to navigate if you had met yourself first. He sat outside the boarding house on the step and watched the sky go from black to dark blue to the particular clear gold that Kansas mornings produced after rain, and he thought about Theresa Gentry. She was not what he would have expected a correspondence bride to be, though he recognized immediately the injustice of whatever expectation he had arrived with, since women in her circumstances were as varied as any other group of human beings, and it was purely his own failing that he had held any picture of them at all. She was sharp and self-possessed, and not inclined to manufacture warmth she did not feel, which he found considerably more attractive than performed sweetness. She was also frightened, though she had been very careful not to show it, and Perry had a particular sensitivity to carefully hidden fear, because he had spent a considerable portion of his own life hiding precisely the same thing. He went to the Caldwell house at 8 in the morning, which was a perfectly respectable hour to call. Clara Briggs let him into the front parlor without comment, which meant she approved, because Clara Briggs did not let men she disapproved of pass the front door of her establishment. She sent word up and Theresa came downstairs in a dark blue dress that had survived the trunk trip without disgrace, her hair pinned up neatly, her face composed. "Mr. Monroe," she said. "Miss Gentry," he replied. "Have you had breakfast?" "Not yet. There is a decent establishment across the street that serves eggs and real coffee, not the kind they brew out of chicory and pretend. Would you care to join me?" He paused. "I have some information about your situation that I think you should hear." She studied him for a moment with those clear, direct eyes that were an interesting shade somewhere between brown and amber that he had been trying not to think about since the previous afternoon with mixed success. Then she said, "All right." They crossed the street together, which felt oddly domestic given that they had known each other for less than 24 hours, and sat across from each other in a small restaurant that smelled of wood smoke and coffee and bacon. The proprietor brought cups without being asked, and Theresa wrapped both hands around hers as though grateful for the warmth, and Perry saw in that small gesture a human need for comfort that she had probably not intended to reveal, and he looked away to give her the privacy of it. "You said you had information," Theresa said. "I know Walter Hatch," Perry said. "Not personally, but I know his methods and his history in this county." He laid out what he knew, carefully and without embellishment, because he had learned that embellishment generally undermined rather than supported truth. He told her about the Delaney family. He told her about Hatch's previous marriages, with the same careful indirection that the townspeople had used, letting the shape of the silence around the facts speak for itself. He told her what he understood of Hatch's operation. Theresa listened without interruption, which he appreciated. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking into her coffee cup. "I need to leave Caldwell," she said, not as a statement of panic but as a statement of logistics. "But I do not have sufficient funds to return to St. Louis, and I have no one there to return to in any case." "Where else could you go?" She was quiet again. Then, as though the words cost her something, she said, "I have a cousin in Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory. We were close as children. I have not corresponded with her in several years, but she married a man with a dry goods business there. I believe she is still there." She paused. "I have no reason to believe she would not take me in if I could get there." Perry looked at her across the table. He did some calculations that were only partially financial. "I am going west," he said. "I mentioned New Mexico territory yesterday." "You did," Theresa said carefully. "I am traveling by horse and I have a mule for supplies. Santa Fe is approximately 600 miles from Caldwell, through Indian Territory and then across the Cimarron Cutoff or the mountain branch of the Santa Fe Trail, depending on conditions and time of year." He paused, choosing his next words with the same care he would have chosen footing on uncertain ground. "It is not safe travel for a woman alone." "I am aware of that," Theresa said, and her voice held a quiet bitterness that told him she was very aware of it, that she had been living with the limitations that singleness and womanhood placed on freedom for long enough that it had become a specific, personal grievance. "I would be willing to escort you," Perry said. "Your safety for the journey in exchange for your company." He paused again. "I mean that in the strictly practical sense. I travel better with someone to talk to, and you appear to be someone worth talking to." Theresa looked at him steadily for a long moment. "You are a stranger," she said. "I am," he agreed. "I have no particular reason to trust you." "Also true," he said. "And yet you pulled my trunk out of the mud and brought me to a safe hotel and found me for breakfast to warn me about a dangerous man, without asking for anything in return." "I am not asking for anything in return now either," he said. "If you would prefer, Clara Briggs has known me by sight for several years and can give you her assessment of my character. She is not a woman who softens her opinions." Another silence. Then Theresa Gentry put down her coffee cup and said, "When were you planning to leave?" "Soon," Perry said. "Hatch is going to hear you arrived. He may already know. The longer you stay in town, the narrower your window." She nodded and he saw her processing it, running through the mathematics of her options with the quick, unsentimental efficiency of a woman who had been doing her own mathematics for years because no one else had been doing them for her. "I will need today to prepare," she said. "The trunk cannot come." "No," Perry agreed. "The trunk cannot come. I am sorry." Something moved across her face at that, a genuine grief that she almost immediately contained, and Perry understood that the trunk was not simply luggage. It was everything she had brought from her former life, the material evidence that she had existed as a person with a home and a history. "I can arrange for Clara Briggs to store it," he said quietly. "If things go as hoped, perhaps it can be forwarded to you eventually." Theresa nodded once. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow morning, early." "Before first light," Perry said. They left the restaurant and Perry spent the rest of the day making his own preparations with the quiet efficiency that came from years of moving quickly. He had 2 horses, his own bay gelding named Captain and a steady Appaloosa mare that he sometimes lent to other riders, and he had a mule called Brutus who was argumentative but reliable, which Perry considered a reasonable trade-off. He purchased additional supplies from the general store, enough for 2 people for 3 weeks, which was a generous estimate for the journey, and he organized everything with the practiced economy of a man who had packed for long rides, often enough that the process was automatic. He also, toward late afternoon, made a quiet inquiry at the county land office about Walter Hatch's current activities, and received information that accelerated his internal timeline. Hatch had already been notified of the stagecoach arrival by the driver, who was apparently on his payroll as an informant. Hatch knew a woman matching Theresa's description had arrived. He was planning to call on the Caldwell house the following morning. Perry went to the Caldwell house and asked Clara Briggs to tell Hatch, if he called, that no woman fitting the description had taken a room there. Clara Briggs looked at him for a moment with her iron-gray assessment, and then said, with great composure, that she had never in her life told Walter Hatch anything true and was not about to start now. He told Theresa the new development when he went back that evening. He told her simply and directly, without dramatizing it, because she was not a woman who needed drama added to actual urgency. She was already packed by then, or rather she had sorted the things she could carry in a saddlebag from the things that could not come, and she was in the middle of folding each remaining item back into the trunk with a precision that was either meticulous or heartbreaking, depending on how you looked at it. Perry helped her carry the trunk down to Clara Briggs's storage room without being asked, and he did not make any observation about the weight of it, because some weights are not the appropriate subject of commentary. Clara Briggs gave Theresa a receipt, and the two women said something to each other quietly that Perry could not hear, and then Theresa came back upstairs with a face that was composed and a pair of eyes that were slightly brighter than they had been, and Perry pretended not to notice either. "I will be ready," she said. "I know," he said. They left Caldwell the following morning at 4 o'clock, in the thick dark before dawn, with Captain and the Appaloosa and Brutus moving quietly through the sleeping town streets, hooves muffled somewhat by the soft ground from the previous day's rain. Theresa sat the Appaloosa with competence, Perry noted with satisfaction. She had ridden before. That would help considerably over the days ahead. They did not speak for the first hour, moving through the dark prairie with only the sound of horses and the wide, spectacular Kansas sky beginning its slow transformation above them. Theresa rode beside him and slightly behind, adjusting her position instinctively as the terrain changed, and Perry found himself glancing at her more often than was strictly necessary for route finding. As the dawn came up and the prairie revealed itself in all its enormous, rolling, grassy glory, Theresa said, "It is very large." "It is," Perry agreed. "I grew up in a city," she said. "I have never been anywhere with so much sky." "You will be amazed at what you can think about when there is nothing in the way of your thinking," Perry said. She turned to look at him, and in the new morning light her face had a different quality than it had under the gray skies of Caldwell, something more open, as though the space were already doing something for her that the enclosed corridors of city life never could. "Is that why you travel?" she asked. He considered the question honestly. "Partly," he said. "Partly because I have not yet found a place that felt like the right size to stop in." What would the right size look like? Another honest question, the kind that required a real answer. "I am not sure I know," he said. "I imagine I would recognize it." They rode in companionable silence for a while after that, and Perry noted with a kind of quiet pleasure that the silence did not need filling, that Theresa Gentry was the rare kind of person who understood that silence between two people who are paying attention to the same world is not absence but presence. They made good time through southern Kansas, camping the first night on open ground away from the trail where Perry built a small fire, and Theresa proved, somewhat to his surprise, that she could cook over an open flame with the same practicality she appeared to bring to everything else. She made coffee and reheated the cornbread Clara Briggs had pressed on them at departure, and they ate in the firelight while the prairie made its nighttime sounds around them, wind and insects and the distant call of something Perry identified as a coyote. "Tell me something true about yourself," Theresa said, looking at the fire. Perry looked at her. It was not a usual thing to say. "My father lost his farm to a creditor," he said, "when I was 19. I watched everything he had built be taken apart and carried away, and I could not stop it." He paused. "That is why I know what Walter Hatch is, because I grew up knowing what the other side of it felt like." Theresa was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry about your father," she said. "He recovered," Perry said. "He found other work. He is still alive, as far as I know, living in Missouri with my younger sister." He paused. "I do not write as often as I should." "Why not?" He thought about this. "Because I am not sure how to explain what I am doing with my life in a way that would make sense to people who are staying in one place." "I think they would understand more than you expect," Theresa said quietly. "People who stay in one place often understand the ones who move. They just do not talk about it." Perry looked at her across the fire. There was something in what she had just said that landed in him in a particular way, that settled somewhere between his ribs like a hand pressing gently on a bruise he had not known was there. "Tell me something true about yourself," he said. She thought about it for a long moment. "I am frightened more often than anyone around me has ever known," she said. "I have been frightened since my father died." I have been doing what needs to be done, and I have not stopped to be frightened where anyone could see, but it is always there." She paused. "I am frightened now. Not of you," she added, as though that needed clarification. "Of all of it, of how very far I am from anything familiar. Being frightened and doing the thing anyway is not a character flaw," Perry said. "It is actually the definition of courage." She looked at him with those amber-brown eyes, and the firelight was in them, and she looked at him for a moment too long to be strictly conversational, and then she looked back at the fire and said, "You are a kinder man than you present yourself to be, Mr. Monroe." "Do not tell anyone," Perry said, and she laughed, a real laugh, the first one he had heard from her, and it was a good sound. They crossed into Indian territory the following day, moving carefully and respecting the land they were traveling through. Perry was not ignorant of the history of the territory, of the nations that had been forced there from their eastern homelands decades prior through policies of removal that had been acts of profound injustice, and he traveled with the awareness that he was a guest in territory that was not his, maintaining a respect in his conduct that he extended as a matter of principle rather than strategy. On the second day in the territory, they encountered a small group of men traveling east who had the look of men who traveled for no good purpose, the loose, opportunistic manner of those who prey on others when they judge it safe to do so. There were 3 of them, and they stopped on the trail and let their gaze move over to Theresa with the specific, degrading assessment that Perry recognized as the preliminary to something worse. Perry moved captain between them and Theresa without fanfare. "Gentlemen," he said, in the tone of a man who is being polite as a professional courtesy, but who is not remotely uncertain about what happens next if politeness is not reciprocated. "Nice horse," said the one in front, whose confidence exceeded his intelligence by an observable margin. "Thank you," Perry said, "and her horse is also nice. Good day." He held the man's gaze with the absolute steadiness that came from having no doubt at all about what he was willing to do, and after a moment that tested several things about several people, the 3 men moved on. Perry waited until they were out of sight around a bend before he let his shoulders drop a quarter-inch from where he had been holding them. "Are you all right?" he asked Theresa. "Yes," she said, in a voice that was steady by effort. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "And then, because it seemed relevant, that happens, on the trail. I want you to know that it will not happen unchallenged, not while I am beside you." "I know that," Theresa said, and then quietly, "Thank you." "That one you may say," Perry told her, and she did smile, though it was smaller than the one at the fire. The days developed their own rhythm as they moved south and west through the territory, and then into the Texas Panhandle, following the Cimarron cutoff of the Santa Fe Trail. Perry proved to be exactly the kind of traveling companion Theresa would have designed if she had been given the option to design one, which she understood was an absurd luxury to recognize, and yet could not help but recognize. He was honest without being confessional, observant without being intrusive, willing to talk for long stretches and equally willing to be quiet for the same. He pointed out things about the landscape that she would have missed, the way certain grasses indicated water below the surface, the behavior of birds before weather changed, the particular quality of New Mexico light that was different from Kansas light in ways she had not imagined light could differ between places. She found herself telling him things she had not told anyone in years. Not in any dramatic, oversharing way, but in the ordinary, accumulative way that happens between people who are spending many hours beside each other with nothing between them and the horizon. She told him about her father, who had been a bookseller, and had given her books before he gave her anything else. She told him about the seamstress shop and the boarding house with the cabbage smell, and the specific loneliness of being young and capable and entirely unknown in a city that had known her family. She told him about the letters from Walter Hatch, and what she had allowed herself to hope from them, and the particular quality of the shame she had felt when the hope turned out to have been aimed at something that was not real. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," Perry said, when she described the shame. "I know that in principle," Theresa said, "but knowing it in principle and feeling it in reality are not the same thing." "No," Perry agreed. "They are not." He paused. For what it is worth, the hope itself was not foolish. The circumstances were deceptive. There is a difference. She looked at him, riding beside her in the long afternoon light, and she thought that there was something very specific about the way Perry Monroe talked to her, something that was different from how men generally talk to women, or at least how men had generally talked to her. He talked to her as though her thoughts and conclusions were the natural product of a functioning intelligence that he had no reason to doubt, rather than things to be managed or redirected or softened before they arrived at the wrong impression. She was falling in love with him. She recognized it with the same clarity with which she recognized most things she would rather not be true, which was to say immediately, and without false comfort. This was inconvenient for a number of reasons, beginning with the fact that she was a woman with no money and no home and no particular future, riding toward a cousin she had not spoken to in years, in the company of a man who had described himself as someone who left when the place stopped fitting. Falling in love with Perry Monroe was the kind of thing that could ruin what was currently working, which was a practical alliance between two people who respected each other. And Theresa had enough experience with the ruins of plans to be wary of introducing new variables. She said nothing about any of this to Perry. Perry, for his part, was engaged in a parallel and equally inconvenient recognition. He had been in the company of women he found attractive before, and he had even been in the company of women he respected. But the combination of the two, plus the specific quality Theresa Gentry had of seeing clearly without cruelty, was producing an internal landscape that felt very different from anything he had previously navigated. He found himself looking forward to every conversation and finding the world more interesting when he could turn to her and say something about it. He found that her laughter, which was not frequent but was entirely genuine, produced in him a warmth that he had long since stopped expecting to feel. He also said nothing about any of this to Theresa. They were approximately 4 days out of Santa Fe when the situation changed in a way that forced both of their hands. They had made camp beside a spring that Perry knew from previous travel, a reliable water source in otherwise dry country, and the horses were hobbled and Brutus was doing whatever Brutus did when not being argumentative, which appeared to involve standing near things and judging them. It was a warm evening, the New Mexico sky pulling out all of its extraordinary colors as the sun went down, purples and golds, and a specific rose that seemed to come from somewhere inside the atmosphere rather than from the light itself. Theresa had gone to the spring to wash, which she did with her customary pragmatic modesty, and Perry was sitting with his back to the spring and his face to the camp, feeding small wood to the fire, when she came back and sat down beside him rather than across from him, which was where she usually sat. Not directly beside him, but closer than the usual distance. He looked at her sideways and she was looking at the fire, and he could see that she was thinking about something with some intensity. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing that requires immediate solution," she said, which was what she said when something did require immediate solution but she was not ready to voice it yet. He waited. "My cousin," she said after a while, "Eleanor. I have been thinking about what it will be like to arrive at her door after so many years." She paused. "We were close as girls, but we have been living very different lives. She has a husband, a business, a settled life. I will be arriving as a relative in need of charity, which is not a position I have ever occupied and do not particularly want to occupy." "You would prefer independence," Perry said, not as a question. "I would always prefer independence," she said, with enough feeling behind it to make it clear that this was not a small preference but a deep one. "I have been dependent on circumstances for too long. On the seamstress shop, on the boarding house, on the hope of a marriage that turned out to be a trap." She stopped. "I want to be able to make my own way. I have skills. I can sew, I can keep accounts, I can teach children to read. I simply need a place stable enough to do those things in." "Santa Fe is growing fast," Perry said thoughtfully. The railroad is coming, possibly within the year. There will be opportunity, she nodded. I hope so. Another silence. Then she turned her head and looked at him directly, and there was something very deliberate in the look, as though she had decided to do something and was doing it before she could change her mind. Perry, she said, using his first name for the first time, and he went very still in the way that he had learned when she said his name, meant something was happening that mattered. Why are you really going to New Mexico territory? He looked at her. He thought about the various answers available to him, the ones that were true and the ones that were simpler than true, and he chose the true one. When I left Caldwell 3 years ago, he said, after the Delaney business, I told myself I would come back when I had a reason that would make a difference. Something that Hatch could not simply dismiss the way he dismissed a lone man with no legal standing. He paused. I did not know what that reason would look like. I only knew I had not finished there. And now, Theresa asked quietly. Now I think the reason might be you, Perry said. What you saw in that letter, the nature of his arrangement with the stagecoach driver, the way he was using correspondence to acquire women as assets, that is something a territorial judge might be very interested in hearing, particularly with Hatch having 2 widowhoods on his record. He paused again. If you were willing to make a statement, to tell what you saw in that letter and what you know of his methods. Theresa was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You came back to Caldwell for Hatch. I was passing through Caldwell, Perry said honestly, but when I stayed, yes, partly. And partly, she asked. He looked at her in the firelight. Her face was clear and direct, and the rose of the New Mexico sunset was still in the sky behind her. And Perry Monroe had spent 29 years being careful about things, and it had served him well, but it had also cost him things he could not fully name, opportunities for the kind of warmth that he was sitting beside right now. And he was tired of the carefulness in the way that a man gets tired of carrying his coat when the weather has changed. Partly because I did not want to leave, he said. You specifically. I did not want to leave you to sort things out alone. Theresa looked at him for a moment that had a particular quality of suspension to it, like the moment at the apex of a swing before gravity reasserts itself. That is a significant thing to admit, she said. I know, he said. Perry, she said, and the way she said his name again was different from how she had said it a minute ago, softer and more particular. I need to tell you something that is equally significant and possibly more inconvenient. All right, he said, and waited. I think I am in love with you, she said, in the same tone she might use to report an unusual weather event, observational and direct and slightly resigned. I have been for approximately 1 week, which I recognize is absurd given that I was on my way to marry a stranger 10 days ago, but I find the heart does not particularly care about what is absurd. Perry Monroe looked at Theresa Gentry across the fire that was between them, and then he got up and moved to her side of the fire and sat down beside her, close enough that their arms were touching, and he said, That is not inconvenient. She looked at him. It is not. No, he said. It is the most convenient thing anyone has said to me in years. He paused. I am in love with you also, for approximately the same amount of time, possibly with a head start of a day because of the trunk. Theresa looked at him with those clear amber-brown eyes, and then she laughed. And this time it was the fullest laugh he had heard from her, warm and real and entirely without reservation. And Perry Monroe, who had not kissed a woman in 4 years, and who was not generally impulsive about anything, reached over and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face with one careful finger, and she turned her face toward the gesture, and he kissed her. It was a quiet kiss, the first kind, the kind that asks rather than assumes, and she answered it with a willingness that was not impetuous but was clear, the same clarity she brought to everything, and when they separated it was the kind of separation that does not really separate anything at all. Well, Theresa said after a moment. Yes, Perry agreed. I believe we need to discuss several things, she said. I believe you are right, he said. But perhaps not immediately, she said. Agreed, he said. and they sat together in the darkening New Mexico evening with their arms touching and the fire between them diminishing to coals, and the sky filled up with more stars than Theresa Gentry had ever seen in her life from the vantage point of St. Louis, Missouri, and she thought that the sky was the right size, that this particular sky was exactly the right size. They arrived in Santa Fe 3 days later, in the dry, luminous late afternoon light of New Mexico territory, riding down the high desert roads into a city that was old in a way that no city east of the Mississippi could be, old with adobe and dust and Spanish history, and the presence of the Pueblo peoples who had been there long before anyone else, old in the way of deep roots rather than accumulated years. Eleanor Marsh, formerly Eleanor Gentry, answered her door on the plaza side of the city and stared at Theresa for a full 5 seconds before bursting into tears and throwing her arms around her cousin, which told Theresa immediately that the welcome she had feared being less than certain was, in fact, entirely certain. Eleanor was 30 years old, sturdy and warm-natured, with her husband Daniel Marsh being a quiet, businesslike man who ran the dry goods store with efficient good humor, and who, when introduced to Perry Monroe, looked him over with the particular assessment of a man who is trying to determine what another man's intentions are toward a woman he considers family, and apparently reached a satisfactory conclusion, because he shook Perry's hand firmly and invited him to supper. That evening, while Daniel and Perry talked business and New Mexico politics over the table, Theresa told Eleanor everything, beginning with the advertisement in the Missouri Republican and ending with the journey from Caldwell, and Eleanor listened with the focused attention of someone who is not going to interrupt because she wants the full story, and then she said, "And the drifter?" "Perry," Theresa said. "And Perry," Eleanor said, smiling. "What is happening there?" "Something significant," Theresa said honestly. "I can see that," Eleanor said. "He watches you the way a man watches something he is afraid to lose." Theresa felt something very warm move through her at that. "He is going back to Caldwell," Theresa said, "to deal with the Walter Hatch situation, with my statement if I will give it. Will you?" "Yes," Theresa said, without any hesitation. The next days in Santa Fe were busy with the kind of busyness that feels like life assembling itself. Theresa wrote out her account of the letter from Walter Hatch in careful, precise detail, and Perry sent it, along with his own account of the Delaney affair and additional testimony from 3 other families, who had since been reached by letter through contacts Perry had maintained, to the territorial court in Santa Fe. The judge, a methodical man named Carruthers who had the reputation of being genuinely immune to bribery, which in a frontier territory was not a given, took a considerable interest in the material. It would take time, Perry explained. Legal processes in the territory moved at the speed of available evidence and judicial attention, neither of which could be guaranteed. But it was moving, and the motion of it had a finality that felt right. Theresa, meanwhile, found Santa Fe to be almost exactly what she had hoped for from Caldwell and not received. It was a town growing into itself, and within the first week she had identified 3 opportunities. The first was a school being organized by the Sisters of Charity that needed teaching volunteers. The second was a seamstress and alterations shop, whose owner was elderly and overwhelmed. The third was that Daniel Marsh's dry goods operation kept its accounts in a state of cheerful chaos that Theresa, who had kept accounts for the St. Louis tailor shop for 2 years, found professionally distressing and immediately offered to regularize. She started all 3 within 2 weeks. She was not, she explained to Perry carefully, looking for charity. She was looking for footing, and she had found it. Perry had not left Santa Fe. He had said he was going west, and Santa Fe was west of Caldwell, and he had made no further statement about direction. He was staying at a hotel on the plaza and taking meals with the Marshes often, and the quality of how he and Theresa talked to each other had shifted since the evening beside the fire in the way that things shift after something true has been said, more open, more direct, warmer without being less clear. One afternoon, approximately 3 weeks after their arrival, Perry appeared at the Marsh dry goods store in the late afternoon when Theresa was working on the accounts, and he sat down across from her at the small desk and watched her for a moment in that particular way he had, the noticing way that she had never found intrusive. "I have been thinking," he said. "About," she said, not looking up from the ledger. "Santa Fe," he said. "Specifically, whether it might be the right size." Theresa put down her pen. She looked at him. "The right size," she repeated. "You said yourself it is a town growing into itself," Perry said. "There is freighting work, which I know. There is also the possibility of a proper freight and supply operation, given the railroad coming. I have some capital saved." He paused. "I am not talking about something that requires an immediate decision. I am talking about a thing I have been thinking about." "Perry Monroe," Theresa said, looking at him with those clear eyes. "Are you talking about staying?" "I am talking about whether there is a reason to stay," he said carefully. "I am talking about whether there is a person who might make this the right size." Theresa Gentry looked at him for a long moment in the dry goods store in Santa Fe in the fall of 1880, with the ledger open in front of her, and the smell of cotton and spice and wood around them. And she thought about the trunk still in Clara Briggs's storage room in Caldwell, Kansas, full of everything she had brought from her former life. And she thought about the fact that former lives sometimes are not lost, but simply relocated into new ones. "I think," she said carefully, "that if you stay, and if I stay, then we ought to have an honest conversation about what exactly it is that we are building here. Because I am not interested in being a reason someone stays and then reconsiders in 6 months. I am interested in something decided." "Decided," Perry repeated, and the way he said it was not resistant but attentive. "What does decided look like?" "It looks like a proposal," Theresa said, matter-of-factly and without any drama whatsoever, because she was Theresa Gentry and she was not going to perform coyness about something this important. Perry Monroe blinked. And then he laughed, a full, real laugh that was the first Theresa had heard from him in the same complete way she had laughed at the campfire, and he shook his head at the laughing, and then he reached across the desk and took her hand in his. "Theresa Gentry," he said, and he was still smiling, but his voice was entirely serious. "I am not a man who has ever been certain about staying anywhere. I have been certain about very few things in my life. But I have been certain about you since you stood in the middle of that mud street and refused to admit you needed help until the trunk was already halfway to China." He paused. "I would very much like to marry you if you will have me. And I would very much like to stay here and build something. With you. I do not know exactly what shape it will take, but I know I want to build it with you, and I think that is the more important part." Theresa looked at him, and at their joined hands on the desk, and she thought about all the weight she had been carrying since her father died, all the practical, necessary, exhausting business of being a woman alone who has to carry everything herself because there is no one else. And she thought about the particular quality of Perry Monroe, the way he had carried her trunk without being asked, and without making it a transaction, and the way he had said nobody travels light when I am around and had meant it not as a boast but as a simple statement of who he was. "Yes," she said, "I will." They were married in Santa Fe 6 weeks later, in November of 1880, in a small ceremony at the Catholic Mission Church on the old Santa Fe Trail, which neither of them was particularly Catholic, but which was the most beautiful building in the city, and which the priest had graciously agreed to make available, having apparently decided that the couple's sincerity was more relevant than their denomination. Eleanor stood beside Theresa and Daniel stood beside Perry, and the handful of people who had come to know them in their weeks in Santa Fe filled the modest space. Theresa wore the blue dress from her saddlebag, the one that had survived the trunk journey, cleaned and pressed and trimmed with a piece of lace that Eleanor had insisted on sewing to the collar. Perry wore his best shirt, which was considerably better than his usual shirt, and he had shaved, which suited him in a way that removed nothing of the quality that Theresa had always found most compelling about his face, that particular steadiness. He took her hand when the ceremony called for it, and held it with the same unpretentious completeness with which he had done everything. And when he said the words, he said them quietly and directly, looking at her, and she said hers the same way. And the priest pronounced them married with what appeared to be genuine satisfaction, as though he had presided over enough weddings to know when one was the real thing. Afterward, Daniel produced a bottle of good brandy from somewhere and they ate together in the Marsh house. And it was warm and noisy, and Theresa laughed more than she had in years, which was remarkable given that she had laughed more in the previous 6 weeks than in the previous 2 years. And Perry watched her laugh, and felt something so complete and quiet settle in him that he recognized it as the thing he had been traveling toward without knowing it. The Walter Hatch matter resolved itself over the following winter in a way that was satisfying if not dramatic. Judge Carruthers, having assembled the testimony from Theresa and Perry and the other affected families, issued a warrant for Hatch's arrest in December of 1880 on charges of fraudulent debt collection and misrepresentation to women through correspondence for financial purposes. Hatch was arrested in January and brought to trial in the spring. He received a sentence of 5 years in the federal territorial prison and a substantial fine, the proceeds of which were used to partially restore the land claims of the families he had defrauded, including the Delaneys, who received back a portion of what they had lost. Perry sent the Delaneys a letter when he heard the outcome. He received a reply from the eldest Delaney son, who was 17, thanking him and saying that the family had rebuilt considerably on what they had kept and that his mother sent her regards. Perry sat with that letter for a long time after reading it, in the way of a man setting down something he has carried very far. He told Theresa about it that evening. She listened to all of it, the history with the Delaneys that he had only partially told her before, and then she put her hand on the side of his face and said, "You did a good thing." "We did a good thing," he said. "Yes," she said, "we did." That winter in Santa Fe was a building winter for Perry and Theresa in every sense of the word. Perry had been right about the freighting opportunity. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway was laying track aggressively, and the supply chains for towns along the route and in the surrounding territory were in constant motion. Perry established a freight and supply operation that was modest in its first year, but had the bones of something considerably larger. He hired 2 men to help with the hauling, one of whom was a former Pueblo man named Felix who had been working odd jobs and who turned out to have an extraordinary knack for logistics and for reading terrain, and who became, over the following months, both an essential partner in the operation and someone Perry considered a friend in the full sense. Theresa taught at the school in the mornings and kept the books for the freight operation and the dry goods store in the afternoons, and in the evenings she sewed, not for survival as she had insent Louis, but for pleasure and for the small income of commissions from the women of Santa Fe who had discovered that she could produce work of a quality not otherwise available in the territory. She was building, too. She was building a self that felt, for the first time in years, fully inhabited. They were happy. It was important to say that simply and without qualification, because happiness between 2 people who have both known its absence has a particular texture that is worth describing. It was not the ferocious happiness of people who have never been sad, which is vivid and loud. It was the deep, sustaining happiness of people who have been cold and are now warm, who have been lost and have found something worth being found by. They argued sometimes, because they were both opinionated and direct, and neither of them was inclined to manage the other's feelings at the expense of honesty. And their arguments had the quality of arguments between 2 people who are not fighting about the thing they appear to be fighting about, but are actually just practicing being honest with each other. And they always resolved. Perry had a tendency toward taking on too much without asking for help, which Theresa found maddening. Theresa had a tendency toward deciding something was settled before she had told Perry that it was under consideration, which Perry found equally maddening. They told each other about these tendencies, directly and without theatrical displays, and slowly and imperfectly they adjusted. In the spring of 1881, Theresa received a letter from Clara Briggs in Caldwell, informing her that the trunk was still safely stored and that the railroad had recently arrived in Caldwell, which meant that freight was moving more regularly, and that if she wanted the trunk shipped to Santa Fe, it could likely be arranged with reasonable dispatch. Theresa sat with that letter for a long time. Perry found her sitting with it in the small front room of the house they had rented, which was a proper adobe house on a side street off the plaza, with a courtyard that caught the evening light and a kitchen large enough to cook in properly. "From Caldwell?" he asked, reading the look on her face. "The trunk can come," she said. Perry sat down beside her. "How do you feel about that?" "Strain," she said honestly. "It is all the things I carried from before, from a life that was very different from this one." "Different but continuous," Perry said. "You carried it from there to here. It is all part of the same story." She looked at him. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Yes, it is." She paused. "Will you help me write to arrange the shipment?" "Nobody travels light when I am around," he said very simply, and she looked at him with such a clear, full expression of love that he was briefly incapable of any further cleverness. The trunk arrived in June of 1881 by rail, which was an extraordinary convenience compared to the stagecoach that had carried it to Caldwell, and Perry drove the wagon to the freight station and loaded it himself and brought it home. Theresa opened it in the courtyard in the warm New Mexico afternoon, and they went through it together, Perry sitting on an upended crate and watching, and occasionally being handed a thing to look at. The letters from her mother, the photographs of her parents, a copy of a particular novel her father had given her on her 16th birthday, a set of good china that had somehow survived the journey unbroken. Theresa held each thing and named it briefly to Perry, and he held each one and listened, and it was, Theresa thought, the most intimate thing they had done, more intimate than kisses or the warmth of the adobe house at night, because she was showing him the full inventory of who she had been before she was who she was now, and he received each item with the same steady, unhurried attention he gave to everything. "That is everything," she said, when the trunk was empty. "Now you know what you carry," Perry said. "Now we know," she said, and he smiled at the correction. In September of 1881, Theresa told Perry that she was pregnant. He went very still for a moment, and she saw several things move across his face in quick succession. The first a flash of something that might have been fear, the instinctive response of a man who had been used to moving without roots, and who felt the tectonic shift of a future becoming permanent and fixed. And then, quickly and without any apparent effort, the fear transformed into something else entirely, something warm and wondering and utterly unguarded in a way she had not seen his face be before. "A baby," he said. "In the spring," she said. He reached over and took her hand and held it for a while without saying anything, which was sometimes his most eloquent mode of communication. And Theresa sat beside him in the courtyard with the evening light turning the adobe walls to gold, and felt the particular settled quality of knowing exactly where she was, and exactly with whom, and exactly what was being built. Their son was born in March of 1882. A fact that surprised no one who had ever met Perry Monroe, and understood his commitment to the principle that things should happen correctly. They named him James Henry Monroe, James for Perry's father and Henry for Theresa's, and he was a robust and loud and thoroughly unambiguous child, who arrived in the world as though he had somewhere specific to be, and was not inclined to wait. Eleanor and Daniel Marsh came to visit within the week, and Eleanor held James Henry with the practiced ease of a woman who had children of her own, two daughters who orbited the Marsh house with the organized chaos of healthy childhood, and she looked at Theresa holding Perry's hand across the bed and said, very quietly to Theresa alone, "You are happy." "Yes," Theresa said, "truly." Eleanor said, because she was that kind of cousin, the kind who meant the question in full. "Truly," Theresa said. The freight operation grew through 1882 and into 1883 as the railroad expanded and the territory's population grew with it. Perry brought Felix more formally into partnership, splitting shares of the operation in a manner that Felix's own acumen had more than justified, and the two of them ran the business with the practical efficiency of men who respected each other's intelligence completely. Theresa continued the books and the teaching and the sewing, and added to these enterprises a small lending library she organized from her own collection and donations from the community, a project that began in the front room of the adobe house and eventually required a dedicated space in the building adjacent to the dry goods store. It was the books that gave Theresa the most satisfaction of all her projects, even more than the accounts or the sewing, because books were what her father had given her, and books were what she was now giving to the children of Santa Fe, including children who were the sons and daughters of the Pueblo communities outside the city, who were being navigated through a moment of tremendous pressure and change in the territory, and whose access to education of any kind was considerably less certain than that of the Anglo children in the settled town. Theresa advocated, with the same quiet, direct persistence she brought to every undertaking, for the inclusion of all children in the lending library's services. It was not always an easy position to hold in a town with its own hierarchies and prejudices, and she navigated it by simply continuing to act as though it were the only reasonable approach, which over time had the effect of making it appear unreasonable to object. Perry supported her in this, as he supported her in everything that she determined was right, not with noise or performance, but with the steady, material support of a man who has decided that the person beside him is worth believing in completely. They bought the house in late 1883, which had been their rental, from the family that owned it, with the proceeds of 2 good years in the freight business. It was a meaningful thing to own the ground they stood on, in a way that had a particular resonance for Perry given his history with his father's farm. He stood in the courtyard after the transaction was completed and looked at the walls and the sky above and said nothing for a long time, and Theresa stood beside him and knew what he was thinking and did not say anything either, because some things are not improved by language. "We own this," he said finally. "We do," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and the New Mexico evening did what it always did, which was to become so beautiful that it required nothing additional from the people inside it. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara, was born in the autumn of 1884, named partly for Clara Briggs of Caldwell, Kansas, who had kept a trunk in her storeroom without charge for nearly a year, and who, when informed of the naming by letter, wrote back with characteristic brevity that she was pleased to hear it, and that she hoped the girl would have a good temper. Clara Monroe was a quieter child than James Henry, observant and deliberate in the way that suggested she was going to arrive at her own conclusions about everything, and not be in any particular hurry about it, which her parents found both admirable and occasionally challenging as she grew. The trunk, by this point, had been fully incorporated into the house, its contents distributed among shelves and drawers and the small places that a home accumulates. The china was in the kitchen and used on Sundays. The photographs were on the mantelpiece, beside the fireplace that Perry had built himself in the coldest year of their tenancy. The letters from Theresa's mother were in a box on the highest shelf of the bedroom, kept because they were part of the story even when they were not part of the daily life. The novel her father had given her was on the reading shelf beside the lending library duplicates that she brought home sometimes to read again herself. The trunk itself sat in the back room, empty now, used occasionally for seasonal storage and sometimes, when James Henry was very small, as a fort, because children have an instinct for discovering the imaginative potential of large containers that no adult planning could have predicted. In 1885, Perry received a letter from his sister in Missouri, the first substantial communication between them in several years, and it contained news that their father had died peacefully in January, at 71 years old, having lived long enough to recover from the loss of the farm and to see the land he eventually worked as a tenant become productive again. The letter also said, without any accusation but with the direct honesty that apparently ran in the family, that their father had spoken of Perry often and had been proud of him, and had hoped he had found what he was looking for. Perry put the letter down and went outside and sat in the courtyard for a while. Theresa came and sat beside him close and put her hand in his without making it a moment for words. After a long time, Perry said, "I should have written more." "Yes," Theresa agreed, because lying to him about it would not have helped him. "You should have." "I will write to Margaret more," he said, meaning his sister. "I know you will," she said, and he did. He also wrote a long letter to Margaret that evening, one that described Santa Fe and the freight operation and Theresa and James, Henry and Clara, with a fullness that was different from any letter he had written to his family before, more specific, more present, as though the grief had loosened something in him that had been held too tight for too long. Margaret wrote back within the month, a warm, detailed letter that inaugurated a genuine correspondence. And over the following years, she and Theresa also began to write to each other. Two women who had never met but who were connected by a man they both loved in entirely different ways, and whose letters developed their own warmth and depth, and the particular intimacy of people who choose to know each other across distance. The freight business in 1886 expanded to include a second operation based in Albuquerque, managed by a young man named Carlos Reyes, who had started as a hauling hand and proven himself through 4 years of work to have both the practical intelligence and the ethical reliability that the operation required. Perry made the offer of partnership to Carlos with the same directness he had extended to Felix, and Carlos accepted it with the mix of gravity and excitement of a young man who has been offered the thing he has been working toward and knows the weight of it. By 1887, the Monroe Freight and Supply Company had 20 employees and a reputation that extended through the New Mexico Territory and into Arizona Territory to the west and Texas to the east, built on the same foundation that Perry had always operated from, doing what he said he would do, when he said he would do it, without drama or excuses. Theresa's lending library had moved twice by this point, each move into a larger space, and she had organized a formal board of directors that included several women from various communities in and around Santa Fe, and the library was on track to apply for territory funding in the coming year. She still taught, though her role had evolved from volunteer teacher to the organizing force behind the primary school curriculum, and she still sewed for private commission, though this had become something she did because she wanted to, not because she needed to. On the evening of their 7th anniversary, November of 1887, Perry came home from the freight office to find Theresa in the kitchen, and James Henry at the table doing his schoolwork with the concentrated ferocity of a child who has decided that a problem will surrender if pursued sufficiently, and Clara asleep in her room, and the house smelling of a pot roast that had been going since midday, and the courtyard outside the window catching the last of the day's extraordinary light. He stood in the doorway and looked at all of it for a moment. Theresa looked up from the stove and saw him standing there and said, "What are you looking at?" "Everything," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment, with those clear eyes that still saw everything they had always seen. Then she put down the spoon she was holding and crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him, and he put his arms around her and held her in the doorway of their kitchen in their house in Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory, with their son doing homework at the table and the evening light in the courtyard, and 7 years of a life built carefully and truly behind them. "Happy anniversary," she said into his shoulder. "Happy anniversary," he said into her hair. James Henry looked up from his homework and made a face that was the universal expression of children watching their parents be affectionate, which was the same in 1887 as it would be in any other year. "Do you have to do that?" he said, not quite a question. "Yes," both his parents said simultaneously, and James Henry returned to his homework with the long-suffering dignity of a boy who has learned that some battles are not worth fighting. In 1888, Theresa discovered she was expecting their third child, which she told Perry on a Sunday morning when they were drinking coffee in the courtyard after James Henry had gone to play with the neighbor's children, and Clara was reading in her room with the absolute focus of a 6-year-old who has discovered that books contain other worlds. Perry received this news with the fullness of a man who had been a father for 6 years and knew what it meant in practice, which was rich and complicated and entirely worth every complicated part of it. "Spring again?" he asked. "Late winter this time," she said. "February or March?" He reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "Better than the first 2 times at this point." They sat in the courtyard with their coffee and the morning light and the comfortable knowledge of what their life was and what it was going to continue to be, and there was nothing strained or forced or performed about the happiness of it. It was as real as the adobe walls around them and the earth beneath them and the enormous sky above. The same sky that had been there when Theresa Gentry had first ridden into New Mexico territory on a borrowed Appaloosa mare beside a drifter who had not known where he was going, but had known that he did not want to leave. Their third child was a son, born in February of 1889, whom they named Robert, and who from his first hours was a child of such serene and unrattleable disposition that his parents looked at each other over his head with the identical expression of 2 people who cannot quite believe their luck. Robert Monroe slept through noises that would have woken his older brother and sister, smiled with the equanimity of someone who has arrived in the world and found it largely acceptable, and grew steadily and quietly through his first year like something planted in good soil with adequate water. The 5 of them in the house on the side street off the plaza made up a world that was complete in the way that worlds built carefully and truly are complete, not without difficulty or uncertainty, because there was always difficulty and uncertainty, and Perry and Theresa had never pretended otherwise, but complete in the sense of being inhabited fully, of being lived in with the whole of themselves. The lending library received its territory funding in 1889, and Theresa stood up in the territorial assembly chamber and made the case for it in a speech that was exactly 22 minutes long, and was described afterward by one assemblyman, who did not intend the description as a compliment, but who was thoroughly wrong about the valuation, as the most precise speech he had ever heard from a woman. She came home afterward, and Perry had dinner ready and the children in bed, and he listened to the whole evening over the meal and then said, "How did it feel?" "Like something I was supposed to do," she said. "Yes," he said, "that is how the right things feel." The freight company continued to grow through the turn of the decade, and Perry's involvement in it shifted gradually from the operational management that he had always handled himself to the supervisory partnership of a business that had developed enough structure and capable people that it could sustain itself without his constant direct involvement. Felix and Carlos and the other partners had made it theirs as much as his, which was exactly what he had intended, and which gave him more time in the middle years of their life in Santa Fe for the things he had not expected to want as much as he turned out to want them. He was home more. He was present for the children's schooling in a way that surprised him with how much it mattered to him. He sat with James Henry over mathematics, and with Clara over her already formidable reading, and with baby Robert, who was not a baby anymore, over the early business of understanding what letters were and how they combined. He built things in the courtyard, improvements to the house that he designed with the careful attention of a man who has finally found the place worth improving. He helped Theresa with the library, carrying books and building shelves, and occasionally, when the situation called for it, speaking on the library's behalf to people who needed to hear a man's voice in order to take the request seriously, which he found both useful and maddening on her behalf, and told her so. They were, as they had always been, honest with each other about what was difficult and what was easy, and what required more than either of them was certain they had, and what turned out to require less. They were, as they had always been, a team in the full sense, not a unit in which one person's needs subordinated the other's, but a genuine working alliance between two people who had looked at each other clearly and chosen each other fully. In the spring of 1892, Margaret Monroe made the journey from Missouri to Santa Fe, bringing her own husband, a steady farmer named William Abbott, and their 2 children, and the visit lasted 3 weeks and was one of the most thoroughly good 3 weeks of Perry's adult life. He and Margaret sat in the courtyard in the evenings after the children had been sent to bed, and talked the way people talk when they have a great deal of time to make up for, and an equal desire to make it up. And they talked about their father and their mother and the farm in Missouri, and the long years of distance that had been Perry's doing and that he had named honestly, and that Margaret had forgiven. Not the quick forgiveness of someone who wants to move past a wound, but the real forgiveness of someone who understands what the wound was and why it happened and chooses restoration over accounting. Theresa and Margaret became, during those 3 weeks, the kind of friends that women sometimes become when they recognize in each other a particular quality of no-nonsense and genuine warmth. And by the time the Abbotts left to return to Missouri, there were plans in motion for a visit the following year in the other direction, which Theresa looked forward to with more pure anticipation than she had felt about a social engagement in years. James Henry Monroe, at 10 years old in 1892, was already the clear inheritor of his father's steadiness and his mother's directness, a combination that made him an interesting child to negotiate with and suggested he was going to be a very compelling adult. Clara at 8 was reading at a level that would have put many adults to shame, and had already decided, with the authority of someone who has thought about it carefully, that she was going to be a teacher, which her mother found deeply gratifying and her father found unsurprising. Robert at 3 was still the world's most serene child, which remained remarkable. It was on the evening of the Abbotts' last night in Santa Fe, when the children were all in bed and Margaret and William had gone to their room and Perry and Theresa were alone in the courtyard in the late summer darkness with the stars above them, that Perry said the thing he had been carrying for a while. "I want to tell you something," he said. Theresa looked at him, reading the particular quality of it. "All right," she said. "When I was in Caldwell the first time before the Delaneys," he said, slowly and carefully, "I was not passing through. I was running from something." He paused and she waited and he continued. "There was a woman in Missouri. We were engaged. She was a good woman and I broke the engagement because I was 23 and terrified of what staying meant, and I convinced myself it was for reasons that were not the real reason." He stopped. "I hurt her. Not violently, not in any illegal or dishonorable way, but I hurt her badly by leaving, and I left because I was a coward about staying, and I have carried that for a long time." Theresa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me." "I should have told you before," he said. "Perhaps," she said. "But you told me now, which suggests you are continuing to decide to be honest with me rather than comfortable, which is what I would want." She paused. "Do you know what became of her?" "She married a year after I left," Perry said. "A man her family had always preferred. From what I heard, she was content." He paused. "I hope she was more than content. I hope she was very happy." "And the guilt you have been carrying," he looked at the courtyard, at the walls they owned, at the life that was made in this place. "I think I have been trying to pay it back," he said, "by not walking away from things that need staying for. By carrying the things that are too heavy to carry alone." He paused. "I think I have been paying it back since I picked up your trunk in Caldwell." Theresa was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Perry Monroe." You did not pick up my trunk as a form of penance. No, he admitted. I picked it up because I could not walk past you in that mud. Then that is the true reason, she said. The penance is a story you have been telling yourself. The real story is that you are a man who cannot walk past someone drowning without doing something about it. He looked at her. That is not a flaw, she said. That is the thing I fell in love with. Alongside the eyes and the steady temper, and the fact that you make very good coffee. Perry looked at his wife in the Santa Fe night, at the woman who had stood in the mud in Caldwell, Kansas, refusing to admit she needed help until she was given it, and he felt the old weight of the guilt shift and become something lighter, not gone, because the conscience does not erase its records entirely, and perhaps should not, but carried differently. The way a thing can be carried when it has been acknowledged and named and held up to the light by someone who sees you clearly. I love you, he said, which was not a thing he said with frequency, not because it was not always true, but because it was always true and therefore did not require constant announcement, but which when he said it had a quality of absolute sincerity that was better than frequency. I love you, Theresa said, and meant it with the same fullness and with the added dimension of a woman who knows the specific man she is saying it to. Not the idea of a man or the hope of one, but the actual Perry Monroe, flaws and steadiness and dark eyes and all. They sat in the courtyard until the night was well advanced, and the stars had wheeled a good portion of their way across the sky. And then they went inside to their house, and their children, and their life. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because no years are, and because Theresa and Perry were not people who required the editing out of difficulty to maintain their happiness, having both understood from their respective beginnings that difficulty was part of the texture of living rather than an interruption of it. There were hard winters and business setbacks, and the ordinary sorrows of life in a growing territory that was still finding its shape. There was the grief of losing Perry's mother in 1893, and the lesser but still real grief of Clara Briggs's death the following year, news of which came by letter from Caldwell, and which Theresa received with a quiet sorrow for a woman who had been kind at a moment, when kindness had been the most necessary thing. There was the news, in 1895, that the Delaney family's eldest son had married and was farming successfully in Kansas, which Perry received with the satisfaction of a ledger column that has finally balanced. There was James Henry, at 13, breaking his arm falling from a horse, and the 6 weeks of his recovery during which he was the least patient version of himself that his parents had ever encountered, and the subsequent lesson about patience that he drew from the experience and applied going forward with what appeared to be genuine philosophical conviction. There was Clara, at 11, standing up to a schoolmaster who had told a Pueblo child that certain books were not for him, and doing so with such calm and complete devastation of the schoolmaster's argument that the incident was talked about in Santa Fe for weeks afterward, and which Theresa received with the mixture of parental pride and worry that is the specific emotional condition of raising a child who is right, but who is also going to continue being this way in a world that is not always ready for it. There was Robert, at 6, discovering arithmetic with a passion that suggested numbers were going to be the organizing principle of his life, which they subsequently became. There were the evenings in the courtyard that accumulated across the years like water in a deep cistern, each one adding to the reserve that sustained everything else. There were the arguments and the reconciliations. There were the illnesses and recoveries. There was the second visit from Margaret and William Abbott, who brought their children, and the reciprocal visit to Missouri that Perry and Theresa made in 1896, taking all 3 children on the train, which was an adventure of considerable magnitude and which gave James Henry and Clara and Robert a relationship with their aunt and cousins that persisted into their adult lives. There was, in 1898, the extraordinary occasion of the library building being formally dedicated as the Gentry Monroe Public Lending Library of Santa Fe. a naming that had been proposed by the board, and that Theresa had accepted with the composure of someone who is deeply moved, but was raised not to make a scene about it. Perry stood beside her at the dedication with James Henry, who was 16 and already taller than his father, and Clara, who was 14 and already the most formidable person in any room she occupied, and Robert, who was 9, and had decided to count the number of people at the ceremony and maintain a running tally. And he felt, standing there in the Santa Fe afternoon with his family around him and his wife being honored for the thing she had built, that the place was the right size. It had always been the right size. He had known it almost from the beginning. He had simply needed the time to understand what right size felt like from the inside. That evening, when the children were in bed and the celebration had quieted, Perry and Theresa sat in the courtyard as they had sat in it so many times over the years, in the particular ease of two people who have chosen each other enough times, and in enough circumstances that the choice has become as natural as breathing. "The library," Perry said, because it still wanted saying. "The library," Theresa agreed, and her voice had the sound of a woman who is fully satisfied. "You built that," he said. "We built it," she said, and looked at him in the way she had looked at him since Caldwell, clearly and directly and without reserve. "Everything good in my life since that mud street has been built with you, Perry Monroe, including me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I dragged a muddy trunk out of the street and told you nobody travels light when I am around." "You did," she said. "I meant it as a general statement," he said. "I did not know at the time that I was talking about the rest of my life." Theresa Gentry Monroe looked at her husband across the courtyard of their house in Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1898, with the stars coming up above the adobe walls and the sound of their children sleeping in the rooms behind them and the whole weight and fullness of an 18-year life together between them. And she said, "I am very glad you were around." "So am I," said Perry Monroe, who had stopped being a drifter the day he stopped being willing to walk past someone who needed help, and who had not regretted it for a single day since. He reached across and took her hand, and they sat in the courtyard and watched the stars until they were ready to go inside. And the house was warm, and the children were sleeping, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and everything that needed to be settled was settled, and every weight that had needed carrying had found its proper place. And the trunk sat in the back room, empty now of its original contents, which had found their homes throughout the house and throughout the life. And there was nothing more to carry from the old world to the new one because they had arrived, fully and finally and together, at the place where carrying ends and belonging begins.